5:42 p.m. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the October 27th, 2021 meeting of the Eugene Budget Committee. Thank you, everyone, for being here. As always, I ask that throughout our proceedings, all of us keep in mind the privilege that allows us to participate here, and consider that many of the members of our community most affected by our decisions may not share that privilege. I encourage us to always remain as mindful of who isn't in the room as we are of who is. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. This format enables the Budget Committee to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. Our first order of business tonight is going to be public comment beginning at 5:35 p.m. So we have another minute and a half or so before we jump into that for people to get their hands raised. Public comment will be on the topics covered by these meetings, which is ARPA and CSI, that's the American Recovery Plan Act, and the Community Safety Initiative. I know our acronyms, I promise. Funding options for the supplemental budget. So if you would like to speak during public comment, you must have virtually raised your hand or pressed *9 if you're joining by phone by 5:35 p.m. Get that in the next minute. After the period ends, the meeting moderator will unraise or disallow any further requests to speak after that time. Per request made in the spring, staff are going to make an effort to provide the list of speakers by quickly typing them up and sharing their screen, since not everyone is necessarily able to see chat. And speakers will be put onto the list in the order that they raise their hand. Each person will have 2 minutes to speak. So in order to allow as many people as possible to speak, I ask that our commenters please be succinct in your comments. And if we do have more people that can speak in 15 minutes, of course, you can always send comments to the Budget Committee through the city's budget website. There's a button at the bottom of that page that says Contact the Budget Committee. And with that, I have stalled our way to 5:35, closing the entry period. So how many people do we have, staff?
Hi, we have 3 people signed up for public comment.
All right, well, let's take it away.
Vicki is going to share her screen in a moment with the list of speakers. First,
you can just call them out since there's only 3. I'm pretty sure they can remember the order in which they have been assigned. If more people come, I'll start adding a list, but.
Okay.
Do we have 2 minutes or 3 minutes on the clock?
2, Abby.
Thanks for sharing the clock, Abby. First, we will have Jacob True, followed by John Borofsky. Jacob, I've allowed you to speak.
Hello, yes, you can hear me, okay. First of all, I just wanted to say it was extremely hard to find this meeting. Getting the link to the Zoom meeting was difficult and I had to go through a lot of steps, so I want to point that out. But anyway, giving millions of dollars to the police while Cahoots is struggling and withering on the vine, and we have many hundreds of people out in the streets without a home, would be a great tragedy. Many of the recommendations from the Ad Hoc Committee on Police Policy from well over 6 months ago had been implemented, I'd be more hopeful. But we've seen only yet more delays. What about tying any police funding to the implementation of these recommendations? I bet that would be getting, I bet that would get things going a little bit better to do something with the hard work that so many of our neighbors on the committee dedicated themselves to. With regards to the community safety officers, if they were proposing eliminating something, 20% or more of the armed patrol officers and replacing them with unarmed social workers or nurses, that would be something worth considering and talking about. What seems to be the current proposal is to add dozens more armed officers and a handful of vaguely defined CSOs. Their argument is that the CSOs can respond to a situation where immediate deadly force is not needed. I'd argue that the vast majority of all crisis situations should not be heightened by the presence of somebody with a gun on their hip. Why not take the funds that would be going to CSOs and instead fully fund and expand Cahoots? It's a working, proven model, nationally recognized, that desperately needs adequate stabilization funding and then expansion. I mean, it makes sense to me. That's all I have to say. Please consider that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Next, we have John Borofsky, followed by Karen Nudsen. John, I've allowed you to speak now.
Good evening, citizen members and councilors of the Budget Committee. My name is John Borofsky, and I'm here representing a working group of the Chamber of Commerce Local Government Affairs Committee. The Chamber welcomes this opportunity to give its input on the allocation of the ARPA funds. We welcome the framework outlined by the city manager, drawing on the Brookings Institute's model, but notice a difference in the third prong, which calls for more community involvement in the implementation phase. We realize that this is one-time money, and we are advocating for strategic spending of the funds that will support many council and community goals, as well as impact the business community that has also been affected by the pandemic. Some of the things we would like you to consider are the possibility of a fund to help impacted businesses and neighborhoods with cleanup and security. We also feel that the housing continuum is an important path to look to when spending these one-time funds. With that in mind, we recommend 1, to continue to look for available safe sleep sites and fund them when appropriate. 2, create a pool of funds to be used for SDC waivers to incentivize and encourage affordable housing to be built. Staff can attest to the need for this. 3, make Affordable Housing Trust Fund whole, replacing the $500,000 moved for rental assistance early in the pandemic. 4, look to opportunities to find properties in the downtown core for purchase as a land bank site for affordable or workforce housing. Another priority for the community is the lack of affordable childcare. One idea we are interested in is to offer grants for childcare providers to cover rent, operational costs, hire more staff, expand capacity, and pay higher wages. We look forward to working collaboratively with the Budget Committee, elected officials, and staff to emerge from the hardships of the last 20 months as a stronger and more vibrant community. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Karen Nudsen, who is our last speaker sign up for public comment. Karen, I've allowed you to speak.
Hello, Budget Committee and councilors. My name is Karen Knudsen, and I am an architect and teach architecture and urban design at the U of O in the planning and architecture departments. And I'm also the founding director of Better Housing Together. I'm also here this evening to offer some additional input to your deliberations around ARPA funds and a request that you help us to prioritize the utilization of these funds to the local housing crisis that our community experiences. Building on some of the points that John Borofsky just raised, of course, support for the sleep sites and transitional housing programs is very important. It is also critical that our affordable housing partners have access to an SDC fund that has capacity. These are dollars that are counted on to deliver those projects, just as federal and state funding dollars are counted on to be able to accomplish them. And our SDC waiver fund is perennially under-sourced for the capacity that our community has to build housing. So that would be an area that we certainly would support and encourage you to direct some of these one-time dollars into. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund, as John mentioned, is just a tool that is just a couple of years old in our community. And we are just at the beginning of seeing the influence that it can have on helping us to meet our local crisis early in the pandemic. The City Council took the strong step to try to stem rental crisis before state and federal dollars were available. And we would request that, given that that fund, $500,000, is now among the $35 million funds available to support rent assistance, that some of this funding return to allow for that fund, which its purpose is to build new affordable housing, have greater capacity. Land bank sites in downtown are a critical part of meeting our community's needs into the future and ensuring that our city center is a place that is home to all sorts of people within our community. And lastly, if you'd like to learn more about the childcare crisis that we face and just how influential rent subsidy can be, listen to the City Club of Eugene program from July 23rd, when our state and local experts spoke specifically to that need.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That concludes our public comment.
Thank you very much. With that, our next order of business is approval of the minutes from our last meeting. Those were available in your meeting packets. Does anyone have any recommended changes or comments to those minutes for the meeting from the 20th? Seeing none, does anyone have a motion to approve?
I move to approve the minutes from our last meeting.
A motion from Eliza Kaczynski, thank you. Does anyone second?
Second.
Councilor Zelenka, thank you. We have all in favor then of approving the minutes, please raise your hands. I'm seeing 13 hands on my screen, and we have one committee member whose camera is still off. Do we have a yes from Siobhan as well? Or a vote? There's a hand. Perfect. I see 14 in favor. That is everyone that is here. So minutes are approved. Thank you very much. With that, it is now time to turn things over to Vicky to show off our fancy new digital budget tool.
Yes, I'm going to share my screen. So over the years, I've worked at least to improve our display of our budget. I know it doesn't seem like the budget document changes year to year, but we do try to review it and make improvements. And I've always appreciated the questions we get from budget committee and the community so that we can make sure that we're giving people the information they need. But this year we went in a completely new direction and we decided to launch a digital budget book. So this allows for better accessibility. It has a reader built in. So if somebody has a visual impairment, they can have it read. And then also there's a lot of alt text and other features in here that make it more accessible for the people who have disabilities and visual impairments. So the other thing that this allows is for an easier way to navigate the document. So one of the challenges we hear from folks is our budget document, the big, large PDF, especially the adopted document, it's over 800 pages long. It's a PDF. Adding links in the document adds to the file size, which makes it a barrier for downloading if you're looking at it online, depending on the people's internet speed and all of that. So this allows for people to navigate way more easy. You can find things, you can search and just do it all online. And if that's not your favorite flavor of ice cream, you can also print this document. So there's a print feature that I'll show you in a minute. But one of the things that I'm super excited about is you can easily find what you're looking for in this, and we will continue to improve this as we move along. This is our first attempt at this, so we'll continue to use this for proposed and future adopted documents. And then for the staff's time, it's just really increased the ability for us to do this in a more expedient way, although this year it's been a little slow because we've been navigating to this. But we'll be able to just copy this over and it has data built behind it so that we don't have to do all that hand entry and copying and pasting from Excel. So there's every section. We've also taken the opportunity to kind of reorganize the document. So I'm super excited for you guys to get a hold of this. I really want to hear your feedback. If you like the changes or if there's things you're still missing or it's not easy to find something. One of the big changes we made is we added a personnel section. So we took all of the bits and pieces of personnel information, wages and health costs and those things and put it in one section. And you can find that here and under this link. So if we went to this, there's the narrative. But there's also a pie chart. It gives you a little ability to get some interactive features here. And then the narrative about healthcare, it's gonna be slow with Zoom going. Come on. So this might look familiar to you. This was in a different part of our document before. It was more in the budget message section. So we've tried to make the personnel section, you can get to FTE information also here. That was kind of spread throughout. So these are the changes that we made in FTE. And then by service area with some narrative. We still have our services section. You can get into the funds We have, we continue to have our fund matrix, which I think is a fan favorite, at least it is of mine. Tells you what the fund does and how you can use the money and where it comes from. But then you can get into the fund information. So we have the overview, as usual, any changes or important things to know. And then you can get into the years of the fund activity, where funding is going. And then it also has more financial details if you'd like to see that. So there's a lot of information in here. We continue to meet both the state requirements for how we display the budget and also the Government Finance Officers Association requirements for the budget award, which, both of those requirements require a lot of information, which makes this a fairly bulky document. So I encourage you, we're going to launch this tomorrow. So it'll go live tomorrow. It currently is not live. I'll be sending out the link so that everybody knows exactly where to get it, but you can get it at the City of Eugene budget website. If you just Googled City of Eugene budget, it will take you right to our section of the city website and you'll get this. So I encourage you to explore this, but I'll just explain a little bit about printing. So if you wanted to print this document, what I particularly like is that you can actually choose the sections you want to print, so you don't have to have an 800-page document if that's not what you want. If there's specific sections that you look at regularly, this is a great way to get those. So you can just choose which ones you want. You can choose more than one, and you have to put your email address in here, and then it will send you an email saying it's on its way, and then you'll get an email when it says it's ready. If you want to print the whole document, you can select all and do that. I will tell you this, that it takes a bit of time for the whole document. You'll get an email that says it could take up to 3 hours, and then you'll get another one saying it's ready. So that being said, I encourage you to explore the website, but I also will be sending out an email tomorrow as well for all of those people who want their full document that's bound like we normally do. We'll be doing that as well. It will look different because it will be generated by this website. So it won't look like the document you've been used to getting, but it will be the full document with all of the information that you'd find on this website. So expect an email from Abby tomorrow asking your preference if you'd like us to print a document for you and where we would deliver it. So that's the latest and greatest. We're super excited about this, and I really would love to hear your feedback when you get into it. We probably won't make changes to this document because any little change, even if it's a spelling error change, it date stamps it as last updated, and I'm trying to prevent confusion about when this document was created and why it wasn't until in November 2022 that so are there any questions about the document? So you'll be getting an email from us, look for that, and we look forward to hearing your feedback as this gets folded into your work. Awesome, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I'm definitely pretty excited for that. I'm not a big fan of the paper book. I like my digital content. So this is, I'll be exploring that and letting you know what I think for sure. With that, next up on our agenda is our presentation and an opportunity for Q&A on the CSI community engagement work.
Thank you, Ty. I think, after last week's meeting, I believe it was Councillor Keating made the comment that he thought it would have been helpful for us to have shared more of our community engagement information that we shared with the council. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're just going to zero in on that portion of the presentation and make sure you understand more fully what that work entailed. So I think I'm handing it to you, Laura. Or Kevin. Somebody.
There you go. Let's start with Kevin. I'll get the slides up though.
I'll take it. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present a summary of the Community Safety Initiative community engagement process that we went through And so I'm ably assisted tonight by Laura Hammond, the Community Relations Director, who will be running the slides. Our intent is to give you a summary of the full presentation that we gave to Council on May 10th. And we wanted to give you about a 15-minute presentation so that it would leave enough time for questions. We've got a number of folks who are available to answer your questions if either Laura or I are unable to. So with that, let's get started. My name is Kevin Altucker. I am the Interim Community Safety Initiative Project Manager, and I have been involved with the project almost since its inception back in 2018. So I'm very happy to be able to present this information to you tonight. Yeah, we've had a lot of staff work on this project throughout. So I think I just want to take a short moment to give a shout out to some folks. This report would not have happened without the hard work of the folks at the HRNI, and in acronym world, that's the Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement folks. So Fabio Andrade and Lorna Flormo were instrumental in collecting and really facilitating a lot of the community engagement process. Also in the city manager's office, Jason Dedrick, and of course, Laura Hammond. We also had a consultant, Liz Kaywood. I want to thank her as well. And with that, let's go to the first slide, Laura. All right, this is the timeline of the CSI, the Community Safety Initiative. Just kind of gives you a grounding of where we came from and where we are today. I will speak to some of these information items on the slide, not all of them. We want to concentrate on the community engagement process. As I mentioned previously, the CSI began way back in 2017, actually. And in 2018, there was a series of community outreach events. And so the purpose of those events were to gather input from the community, but to also to educate the community about some of the community safety challenges that we were seeing then, and in fact, we are still seeing today. And so we had police chief, fire chief, and other folks attending scores of neighborhood events to listen to folks and also communicate about some of the challenges that they were experiencing. It's also important to note that we had a scientifically valid telephone survey completed in 2018. It had 408 responses. And we collected a lot of useful information, good data from that. We also created an online survey that was available for folks who wanted to take it. It was available on the city website. We had almost 2,500 responses to that survey. It was crafted very, very closely to the scientific telephone survey, and the results correlated very strongly. In 2019, as we all remember, the City Council approved the ordinance that included the CSI payroll tax, which is forecasted to bring in somewhere in the neighborhood of $23.6 million per year for the 5 CSI funding areas, which include youth prevention services, homelessness services, the municipal court, fire and EMS, and also Eugene Police. The murder of George Floyd in May of last year really was a watershed event for not only our nation, but also our community. Sparked nationwide protests, and of course we experienced protests here in Eugene and Springfield. To the council's credit, they said, you know, I think this is a good time to start a community engagement process. And so that included 2 things. One of them was the ad hoc Committee on Police Reform, which we will not be speaking to tonight, but some of you are very familiar with that process. But it also included a series of community engagement processes. And Laura's going to speak to that here in more detail. So I'm just setting that up. And of course, as we all know, the payroll tax collections began, and they started January 1st of this year in 2021. So with that, I will hand the virtual mic over to Laura, and she'll step us through some details from those community engagement sessions.
Uh-oh.
No great presentation ever starts with uh-oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Shoot. So sorry.
I'm just here for humor.
Yeah, that was great. How's that? Okay. Sorry about that. Yes, the goals of the CSI engagement process were focused on engaging and getting input from communities of color related to CSI, as well as hearing from the public in general. The City Council approved a plan that included 3 engagement methods to gather this input. The first was a round of focus groups with Black, Indigenous, and people of color and members of the Jewish and LGBTQ+ communities to understand their perceptions of the CSI, as well as identify gaps and strategies that were important to them. The information collected from these focus groups was used to help inform the development of an online survey that was open to the entire community. And finally, 2 listening sessions were also open to the public to gather input on CSI. The community interest on this topic was high, and we did have good participation in each of these engagement methods, which we'll talk more about. First off, the focus groups. Our human rights team recruited people associated with organizations representing the BIPOC, Jewish, and LGBTQ+ communities, as well as individuals who shared those identities but were not connected to specific organizations. We had 35 participants total who were assigned to 1 of 4 focus groups. Every participant was asked to watch a webinar video that was created to help kind of explain the CSI, its background, its development, as well as the uses and constraints of CSI funding. The webinar is available on the CSI engagement website. Staff took notes and analyzed the transcripts of these focus group sessions to identify themes, and several themes emerged. Cultural responsiveness and related topics appeared as a dominant theme. Most participants spoke to the need of safety services being offered in a way that is respectful of their identities. According to focus group participants, staff and police and other safety services need to understand the needs of marginalized communities and invest time in developing relationships with them. Additionally, more representation of BIPOC people in those services would support increased cultural responsiveness. Many focus group participants also expressed a desire for CSI strategies to shift focus from response to prevention. For example, many participants spoke to the importance of addressing the causes of homelessness and how to help people transition to stable housing instead of focusing on responding to temporary encampments. For some participants, the CSI was developed without much consideration of the needs of their communities. Thus, the original CSI strategies and funding allocation reflected a concept of safety that is connected to responding to property crimes or fear, in their opinion. For those focus group participants, the focus should be on reducing the numbers of calls requiring police response instead of reducing the time to respond to those calls. As a consequence of that understanding of safety and associated metrics, focus group participants were very supportive of alternatives to law enforcement. A final important theme was the need for more mental health services, including support for the partnership between the city and county to increase availability and access to mental health services. In addition to the focus groups, we held 2 community listening sessions in late March that were open to everyone. We again shared that CSR webinar video to help familiarize participants with the CSI and ask similar questions to those used in the focus group. We had a total of 101 participants in those sessions, although not all participants chose to speak during the sessions. Similar to the focus group, themes were derived from transcripts of the comments shared during those sessions. Key themes that emerged from the listening sessions were similar to the focus group. Law enforcement and policing was a main theme, including requests to reduce CSI funding for police, some negative views of police action, and a desire for police to focus on the use of de-escalation techniques. Unhoused people was also a prominent theme. People expressed a desire to see more services for the unhoused, increased housing services, and prevention of the criminalization of homelessness. A connection between community safety and mental health was a common theme theme among listening sessions. Participants demonstrated support for CAHOOTS interventions in mental health crises, suggested an alternative response system to deal with mental health calls, requested an increase in funding for mental health services, and increased funding for addiction services. A fourth theme represents the views of those who supported the existing proposed allocation for CSI funds. Participants mentioned that CSI funds should follow the percentages proposed in 2008, and some expressed support for police officers. Community wellness emerged as a theme as well. A number of participants mentioned the need for emphasis on prevention at the system-wide level. And finally, an online survey was launched in March of 2020 in both English and Spanish. It was open throughout that month until early April. The aim of the survey was to collect input on both the original CSI strategies as well as the strategies and needs that had been identified during the focus group sessions. The English language survey received over 2,400 responses. And for the Spanish language survey, we partnered with the Spanish language Facebook station La Iquis to conduct culturally specific outreach to the monolingual Spanish-speaking community through Aquí en la Ciudad, a broadcast done on Facebook. The Spanish language survey received 113 responses. The survey provided an opportunity to get broader community feedback on both the original CSI strategies and strategies identified by the focus group. It asked respondents to prioritize the original and new strategies, both on their own and combined. Overall, the top priorities that for all respondents, when we looked at the combined list, included a mix of the original and new priorities, including emergency shelter and services that help people experiencing homelessness, increased ability to respond to calls for help with mental health services or other alternative responses in situations that may not require the police presence, increased capacity to serve people with mental health and addiction services, ability of police to respond to more calls for service in less time, targeted youth prevention and intervention programs designed to keep youth out of the criminal justice system, diverting individuals away from the criminal justice process through intervention programs that provide an opportunity for education and community service, capacity in our jail system to hold people for the length of their sentence, and increasing the number of community safety officers to perform functions in support of public safety that don't require a patrol officer. The survey also included questions related to the support for an alternative to 911 for non-criminal emergencies and asked people about their experiences with CSI service. You can get a much more detailed information about those responses as well as summaries to the open-ended questions in the full report, which is available on the city's website. And I'll just turn it back over to Kevin to provide a little bit more of a summary.
Sure, thanks, Laura. So this is the summary slide. And so what I want to stress is that the CSI engagement process was comprehensive. Was it perfect? No, it wasn't perfect. I don't know that any engagement session or efforts are, entirely perfect, but it was pretty darn good. And these were the overall key findings. So there were several new strategies that came up in these sessions, as Laura identified, and some of them are listed again here on this slide. And a lot of the original strategies were also supported. So homelessness, still a high priority, no surprise there across all groups. There was an interest for an increased capacity for mental health services, which was mentioned by Laura. That was a little bit of a new strategy. Also support for alternative response. So matching the response to the need was also something was brought up. And in addition to that, folks were interested in an alternative to the 911 system for non-emergency calls. There was also, and this is important to note, there was significant support for increasing police capacity to answer more calls in less time, just addressing that issue that we still have of not being able to service all of the calls that the police receive in any one particular day. And then finally, there was support for youth prevention programs and diversion from folks from the criminal justice system. And that's really one of the brilliant things about the CSI program is it's designed as a system, and it's designed to provide off-ramps for folks so that they don't get enmeshed into the criminal justice system. So with that, I have one more slide. It's another reminder that if you are interested in the full report, if you're interested in watching the work session on May 10th, the links to those sessions and that report are on the screen. But for those of folks who may not be able to see the screen right now, suffice to say that you can access the city website and get these documents and see the webcast. So with that, that concludes our presentation, and we would like to entertain your questions.
Thank you so much. If anyone, we're just going to do this in the Q&A fashion. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and throw that virtual hand up. Catherine.
I was wondering if, and I was just going to try to pull, I looked at the report back in back when it had happened and have not come back to it. So I was wondering, I had two questions around the survey and the more general community listening sessions, both kind of around how the word was put out for those and sort of recruitment for the listening sessions, and then if we have like demographic or other characteristic and about the folks who were engaged on those two pieces.
Catherine, you cut out just at the end there, and I kind of missed the meat of your question. Sorry.
It was, sorry. Basically whether we have demographic or other similar type information for folks who participated in the general community listening session and the surveys.
We definitely do for the surveys. We do not for the community listening sessions.
Is that information in the report, or would that need to be?
The demographic information for the survey participants is in the report, yes.
Okay, I can go find that. So then for the community listening sessions, what was the process for kind of like recruiting, getting the word out on those, or recruiting folks into those?
Yeah, Laura's probably better able to answer that than I am. So Laura?
Sure. You know, I think at that time, I'm thinking back, and my memory serves, we did do a press release about all the engagement processes that were happening, and we were actively promoting them through our social media channels as well as our website, putting out information through community newsletters as they are available to us, and also through the neighborhood associations. I also know that, you know, HRNI was heavily invested in this process, so they were working to make sure folks in their networks were also aware of the community listening sessions. So kind of a variety of methods there, but a lot of them just using our main channels of communication through media and online.
Okay, thanks.
I've seen hands next from Ryan and then Raina.
So there's kind of an elephant in the room that I kind of want to just go straight at. Since the murder of George Floyd and the huge public outcry, there have been a lot of calls for either complete defunding or at least reforming police systems across the country and here. And it seems like a large part of the community input processes that we had going on, they seem to emphasize, I pulled out a quote that we just covered, support for increasing police capacity to respond to more calls in less time. And that's obviously the opposite of the outcry that I've heard in the community. So I wanted to know, what's the cause of that differential, or is that making any sense? I just want to know, how are we reconciling those two things that seem to be opposites to me?
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of where not only our community is, but probably our nation as a whole. So there are folks who believe that we would be best served by defunding or channeling money away from the police. And there's also a significant portion of the population that is not supportive of that, but at the same time supportive of improving police practices. So I think, you know, it's a complex situation that we have, and I think our community response reflects that.
Mr. Chair, could I ask a follow-up? Sorry, real fast. I had a second question. I should have led with that. Just off the top of anyone's head, I think it would be helpful to the community to know what sort of substantial changes have been made to the CSI plan between when it was originally conceived and the murder in 2020 and the outcry after that. What significant changes have been made to the plan?
I'll answer briefly, and then I will ask Chief Skinner if he's available to add his comments. But throughout the process, Ryan, the CSI has been trying to be responsive to changing community needs and changing community viewpoints. And so, for example, when we talk about alternative response, that wasn't really part of the original plan, but we began to hear pretty loud and clear that that was something that the community wanted. And so there have been, well, the request to the budget committee reflects that in terms of boosting the CSO program to provide an unarmed response to many of the calls that don't need a sworn police officer with a gun on her hip. So that's one example, and I'll hand it over to Chief Skinner if he's available.
I'm indeed available, and I think it's a great question. Ryan, you're right. There is definitely a couple of different messages that we've heard over the last couple of years around the direction you should be going in public safety, and there are some alignments with various groups on what we should be doing different around police reform or finding a different way to respond when needed to safety or life or property safety issues. The challenge that we still face is that we still have people being victimized every single day in this community in one way or another. And we still get those phone calls, and those folks have an expectation that there'll be some level of response by our organization. Some of those calls are specifically police-related calls when it comes to safety-related issues. And some of those calls aren't necessarily police response. And so when we think about doing something differently, such as the CSO program, which is specifically designed to respond to victims of criminal behavior that no longer pose an immediate threat and or support to our patrol division, and not designed to respond to cahoots calls. I just want to make that clear, that there's been no indication from me that I'm looking to divert cahoots calls back to CSOs. Cahoots is really good at what they do, and I want them doing that work. So those are things that are really important that I think our community should know. It's been hard to think about how we adjust this plan when the pandemic has thrown a huge wrench in knowing where this plan would potentially go. The original plan was built around the concept of $23.6 million, and that was pre-pandemic. And so I think all of us have been waiting to see what this pandemic does to those revenues, and waiting for really crucial input from our community members and our council members around any adjustments they'd like to see to that plan. So there's been no major changes to the plan, but we are waiting to do the changes that make sense for this community. And I think the CSO adjustment that we've seen in this supplemental budget is an example of that. That was never a part of the original plan, but over the course of the last 2 years, knowing now what I know, it seems responsible to continue to invest in resources right now that can respond to those low-level calls for service that people continue asking us to respond to.
Chair, I'd like to just weigh in 1 second too. Ryan, I would say that, you know, my commitment to this budget committee was that we weren't going to adjust any of that CSI funding until we had an opportunity to meet with the council and meet with you. And the supplemental budget represents our first opportunity to do that. It's the first additional revenue that we've had. And so that was the purpose of the presentation, to sort of get your feedback on that, get council's feedback on it, and in anticipation that we would have the ability to fund something in December.
Raina, And then I see Eliza's hand next.
I think this question might be more for Chief Skinner. It somewhat piggybacks on what was previously talked about. In the report, there was requests, and I think even from the citizen who spoke, John or Jacob, sorry, who spoke earlier today about de-escalation techniques. And I'm curious, and I'm sure the public would be curious too, about what in the budget goes towards new methods of training and what current or new strategies are being invested in, so that as new officers or current officers continue their work, their important work of taking in these calls, when they arrive at the scene, they're de-escalating instead of escalating situations.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And interestingly enough, we just sat down last week and looked at our next year's training calendar, because we have this conversation every year around strategically planning for what training we want to deliver. There's some trainings that are mandated by the state that we have to do to keep our certifications. And so certainly we carve out time for those. And those are kind of some of the hard skills, the low frequency, high risk things that we have to be certified to be able to do. But the rest of that training calendar is filled with opportunities around crisis intervention, de-escalation, and in some cases, bringing in subject matter experts that are local people that experience our service, bringing them in to talk about their experiences or help us see things through their perspective and their lens, to include implicit bias types of training. So every year we go through, it's not just our new officers that we really need to invest in, it's all of our staff. And it's not just officers, it's officers, CSOs, our professional staff have the ability to get this training, because in some respects, there's opportunities to de-escalate in a lot of different areas. And so it's an ongoing, purposeful, and intentional training strategy every single year that has those things. And it's not something that we do like every year, it's the same old thing. We try to find different ways to deliver different types of training and invite people to be able to do that. And so we want it fresh, we want it new, we want new perspectives, but there is intentionality every year around those kind of core competencies of those skills, so that we're making sure that we're de-escalating where at all possible we're able to do that.
Thank you, Eliza, and then Councillor Keating.
So I think slightly connected to our previous presentation, I really do appreciate the paper copies of things, because I'm actually looking at the materials from that revenue subcommittee from 2018. And I'm looking at what the different proposals were for service at that time when we were first talking about it. And I'm seeing 10 community service officers included in both the level 2 and 3. So are the service officers that we're approving or that are included in this budget, is that represent an increase in the number of community service officers, or is it an implementation of the 10 that were included in that original proposal?
Yeah, a good question. So in the bridge funding, you may remember we grabbed 5 of those in the bridge funding, okay, along with street crimes. And so 5 of those were left still in the CSI implementation. And what I'm proposing and what I'm finding out, and again, I wish I knew then what I know now, but we know so much more after being kind of down this path 2.5 years from implement, or at least trying to come up with a strategy. And what I'm finding now is, instead of grabbing resources and just trying to pick the volume and putting them kind of in the same old places within our organization, at least from the CSO perspective, what I'm finding is more valuable is we actually build an intentional program around this that involves the right supervision for these people, that involves the right deployment strategy, and really narrows the focus on the things that they respond to, and equipping them and training them to be able to respond to those things, so that we can not have to send an armed police officer to everything. And so what you see in this request is actually probably the second half of the other 5, so the second half of the 10, and then an enhancement on top of that to actually build a program so we can get as close to 24/7 coverage as we can. Because as you know, we're a 24/7 shop, and it's busy all the time for the most part. And so just having them on short periods of time during the day doesn't make a lot of sense if we're trying to actually have a robust service delivery model. So we're looking at more of a 24/7 model, and that's why you see more CSS.
Okay, because I know when this was talked about, it was always going to take time to build up to it. Like between all the different categories, there's like 50 people who are getting hired. And I think we knew that we would not be able to add all those people all like in the same year. So we should expect to see further increases in CSOs in the future beyond that initial 10.
Well, when you say the initial 10, you know, we have like, again, we have the 5 already. Well, we already have some CSOs that were a part of our organization to begin with. So the CSI didn't add the CSO as a new resource. We already have some here. We have the 5 in the bridge. And then what I'm proposing in the supplemental budget is to build out the rest of that program and start hiring those folks, getting those cars ordered. You know, as with everything, when you're trying to add more capacity and resources, it's not just as easy as going out and finding the individuals. There's capital needs around vehicles and equipment. There's training needs, and obviously the hiring process will happen. So what I would envision if we were to build this program is that we would get started early January, and we would actually build this CSO program throughout the rest of FY22 as they come on.
Okay, so the changes basically in the way we're thinking about the program primarily.
That is a very fair assessment, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Keating.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make certain before I ask the Chief a couple of questions about mental health services and alternatives to 911 in particular. I wanted to just make certain that the community engagement sessions correlated with the survey response and online surveys as well. I believe, Kevin, you mentioned that the survey response and the online survey responses from 2018 respectively, there was correlation, but I want to see about the correlation a couple years down the road in as Ryan alluded to, in a post George Floyd world.
Counselor, I'm not sure I understand your question. Sorry.
Well, the CSI engagement survey, there were several issues that rose to the top of the crop, including but not limited to responding to calls in less time, increasing the number of CSOs, alternatives for 911 for non-criminal emergencies, and increased capacity in mental health services. Did those priorities match the priorities that were indicated just a couple years earlier through the online survey and the telephonic survey?
There was a lot of overlap, but the most recent survey did bring up some new themes and concerns and interests. So, you know, we can't scientifically, you know, calculate the correlation between the two because they were two totally different instruments. But we know just by working with the data, there was a lot of overlap and a lot of, you know, a handful of new interests and ideas.
The scientific telephonic survey, was that the only of the 3 aforementioned surveys that was a random sampling, and were the others self-selecting?
That is correct.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Chief, if I could just address a couple of the issues I brought up at the top of my questions. One is I believe it's been almost a 20-year project in New York. I think they launched it in 2003, an effort to have 311 be a non-emergency 3-digit number. Are there any plans with CSI funds in the future to adopt a 3-digit non-emergency number, recognizing that there appears to be a thirst expressed by community members through at least one, if not all, of the aforementioned surveys?
There's no specific plan about that. Some of the energy that we've seen around the state with respect to carving out a separate number for people to call has been mostly centered around suicidal ideology, and has not been proffered as being a kind of a catch basin or a catch-all for all mental health and behavioral health issues. It's very well. It's narrowly focused for suicide prevention in the way of like a suicide hotline.
Got it. So the best place for folks to call is still the Eugene Police non-emergency line, should there be a mental health crisis, that 682-5111 number, correct?
Right now, that's what we do have. And if you call that number, what the caller is met with is an option for police, fire, and cahoots. So we immediately announce cahoots as an option for callers, and then it lets the call takers triage that. We've talked about just conceptually in the CSI, and this is what I love about the creativity within the CSI, is whether or not having an MHP or mental health professionals embedded in dispatch would be helpful to help triage those calls. So we're really open to that level of creativity. The advantage that we have on a public safety answering point, all those calls coming to the public safety answering point, is that we do a really good job of deconflicting, in the sense that we're not sending multiple responses or multiple resources to the same call, which then can be could become a dangerous thing. Because as you know, we could have two separate callers on two separate platforms giving us two completely different accounts of what they see about the exact same call. And now we're sending, separate resources, and that can get a little bit dangerous. So I like the idea of the left hand knowing what the right hand's doing when it comes to sending the right response.
Thank you for that. I applaud that. A mutual friend of ours who's on the Planning Commission is an ardent advocate for a TIP, for increasing mental health services when there is an emergency, providing some support network for families in crisis. Chief, is there an opportunity with CSI funding or existing funding or future funding to invest in those, what I consider to be vital mental health services for families of folks who suffer a tragedy in our community?
I do, and I think that this is the great discussion to have, and I think this is probably the platform or the mechanism, the revenue mechanism by which we can do something. The TIP program, for those of you that don't know, is Trauma Intervention Program, which is a nationwide program, and most recently is in Portland, that leverages the volunteers that come out to those trauma types of incidences or crisis, that we can do that. I think there's a lot of gaps in our service delivery model up and down mental and behavioral health. And I think there's opportunities to get creative on how we fill those gaps. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say, at the end of all of this, with respect to responding to the critical incident that's happening at the time, if we don't pay attention to the back end of creating off-ramps for these people so they don't become frequent, we're not responding to them frequently and over and over and over again, that we're just continuing to do the same thing every single day. We have to pay attention to what some of our local and federal and state partners can do to help build the back end of the system.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And it looks like we have questions from Siobhan next, followed by Councilor Cyrus.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions about the calls. The first one is, who decides which calls are answered and which ones go unanswered?
It's fairly complex. So as calls come in, both 911 and non-emergency calls, they are triaged and go through a battery of Q&A to help determine what is the best response for that particular need. And then they're assigned a priority. We have priority 1 through priority 9. And you can imagine what priority 1 would be as being your most emergent call, life safety call, and priority 9, which would be obviously really low, maybe more of a livability type of call that doesn't require an immediate response. Those calls then get shipped to a dispatcher. So the call taker takes the call, they get shipped to a dispatcher. And the dispatcher is really tasked with managing his or her resources, knowing how many resources they have on shift at that time, and trying to do a good job of sending those calls and dispatching those calls to those available resources. As we run out of resources for calls, those other calls hold in abeyance until resources are free. The problem is as those other calls hold and wait for a resource, we have new calls coming in that have a tendency to be higher priority. And so they constantly take priority over those calls that we don't go to. So when you hear me talk about 163 calls on average per day go unanswered, that's across the patrol division, that's across the CSO opportunity and the cahoots opportunity to respond. It's all based on the volume of calls that are coming in and where they get, what takes priority. And so those other calls don't get responded to just by virtue of just never having enough resource to be able to get to that call.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that, Chief Skinner. I have another follow-up one. So, so you said priority level of 1 to 9. I'm curious, do you have any data on how many calls go unanswered per that priority level scale?
We have that data. We could absolutely identify a percentage of calls that are in the certain priorities that go unanswered. I don't know that right off the top of my head. Anecdotally, of course, our priority 1, 2, and 3 calls are going to be our most important and the ones that will always get the most attention, especially priority 1 calls. And a lot of the calls are going to be in that lower tier, but I can certainly pull that data together. We've got a really talented team that does the analytics around this, and we can absolutely get that for you.
Okay, and then last but not least, I was thinking about the Csi funds, and is there any way to maybe perhaps use them to increase surveillance, so like cameras or stuff like that in our town?
So we're always looking at strategies that don't have to leverage a human being to actually move us forward. And so there absolutely is opportunity within the CSI. When we think about community safety, it doesn't just mean, hiring a bunch of human beings to do this work. For instance, one of the things I'm looking at right now, and don't give away my secrets, but one of the things that I'm looking at right now is looking at a solution that we might build that mirrors very closely an experience you would have with a telehealth visit, where you get to put in your appointment time and actually get online and virtually meet with a doctor. I'm trying to build a system that allows for people to put in the time and actually have a virtual meeting with a CSO or a police officer or somebody that can take their complaint and take their information so they feel heard and connected and better served, rather than what's happening now, which is, thank you for your call. We'll have somebody call you when we're available, and then they sit for hours or days waiting for a phone call. So technology is a big piece of what I think can make us more efficient, and I'm always happy to look at those things.
Thank you, Councillor Sirett, and then I've got a second round for Eliza.
Chair, I don't have any questions. I have some thoughts, and so maybe it's better to wait till another time in the agenda. I would have messaged you, but there is no chat function in this current iteration of Zoom, which just for staff's knowledge is actually really helpful. Ty and I were messaging each other during the last meeting to clarify some things, not things operational things and how to be in the queue, not like policy questions or that kind of thing. So if we could have the Zoom have chat next at future budget committee meetings, that would be great, just for being helpful in running the meeting. So I think probably I'll wait, Chair, until we're in discussion part of the meeting.
All right. After this Q&A, we're going to a break, and then we're coming back, and discussion's all that's left on the agenda, so that'll work great. Eliza and Catherine also. You're muted, Eliza.
Sorry, I unraised my hand, but didn't unmute myself. A couple of people have mentioned the statistically valid survey that was done in 2018. Is there any intent? I know it can be confusing and difficult to sort through self-selected feedback from people. It can be hard to get a sense of how, I hear a lot of things at public comment that it's one person's opinion. And so really, is there any intent to do another survey like that to kind of help gauge how the community's views on this is changing on a less self-selected way?
Specifically for CSI?
Yeah, or for other stuff too.
Yeah, well, Maybe City Manager Maderi could speak to that. I do know that there, and maybe Laura as well.
I think I would rely on Laura for this.
Okay, sure. Yes, we are looking at a community survey. It's broader than just the CSI, but I imagine it will definitely include questions to help us measure impacts and information around CSI. So while it won't focus solely on this, the broader community survey is in the works.
Then can I give a quick piece of feedback for that survey if it happens, or when it happens? If I recall correctly, the 2018 survey was a survey of likely voters, which produced demographics that didn't necessarily represent the residents of our community. For example, 65% of the respondents were over age 65 and 75% of them own their own home, which is not true of the people who live in our community. And so, if we're doing future surveys like that, I think they would be more helpful if they were of residents and not likely voters.
Yes, agreed. That would be our intent with the next iteration of the community survey.
Thank you, Catherine.
I had a couple, I think these are Chief Skinner questions, not engagement questions, so apologies. I wanted to get some clarity about for CSOs, whether they carry two things. One is whether they carry any type of weapons. I know they don't have firearms, but if they have anything else. And then the other one is what, if any, like, what kind of information sharing happens between them and other officers in terms of if they see something, or because I know they don't have enforcement authority, but what would be sort of their obligation to report things that are happening or that type of thing?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of that, they do go through a significant amount of training so they can keep themselves safe. So the current environment we're in now, they do look different than an officer, but there is still a uniform. And unfortunately, sometimes people don't delineate between the two, and they are in harm's way from time to time. People who are looking to harm somebody in uniform, they could be a target of that. So we do train them. We are currently entertaining the concept of them having tasers available in the event that they have to defend themselves or somebody else in the event that they have that encounter. But we anticipate that being very infrequent, if that's going to ever happen. So we're going through the process of trying to make sure that they're safe and that they have the tools available to keep themselves and others safe. There is constant communication between them and the patrol division because they oftentimes are responding to cold calls that are criminal in nature and doing investigations. And so from time to time, they will respond on scene, start an investigation or be meeting with a victim only to have a suspect show back up. And we don't want to put them in a position where they're being confronted or having confrontation with suspects. So there's constant communication with patrol. They share the same radio frequency. We often supplement patrol for when patrol is dealing, like, for instance, here's a low-level example. We have a traffic crash. It's oftentimes you will see the CSOs that are doing the traffic control around traffic crashes. Instead of tying up our law enforcement officers doing that, they can focus on the investigation while the CSOs do traffic control and those types of things. So it very much is kind of a very close relationship with our patrol division, because largely that's what generates the work that they have. And that's largely what we're trying to do, is trying to have them fill the gaps of the calls that cannot be answered by patrol division, and that we quite frankly don't need our patrol division to answer or to respond to. So yes, there's all of those things are in play, and I'm excited about kind of reinventing them. We were just having a conversation today, Catherine, about evaluating what police officers should and shouldn't be going to, and a conversation about CSOs, what should they and should they not be going to. I want to be careful that we don't have mission creep, or that we just try and throw everything on their shoulders, because we'll be right back in the same situation.
Follow-up question. is there, so if there was a situation where a CSO was responding to something and there wasn't necessarily anything, like the situation wasn't escalating in terms of kind of violence or physical harm, but there was potentially something illegal happening, would they, I'm thinking of like, what would their response be? Would they call another officer and have them come and handle that? Would they not? What does that look like?
So maybe, there's a tremendous amount of discretion that's exercised by our police officers on what we enforce and what we don't. Our CSOs have a tremendous amount of discretion. If they're working on something and they witness a crime in progress that's of serious nature, they certainly would probably reach out to patrol and say, hey, this is what's happening and this is what I'm seeing. They certainly wouldn't be expected to intervene in that particular situation, but they would use good judgment on whether or not it was something that the patrol should respond to or not. In other cases, it might be something that's very, very low level in the sense that it's not, it's not one of those emergent needs that would need a patrol response, and they very well may just use their discretion and not call that in. So it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. There's no hard and fast rule that says thou shalt call patrol every time you see a crime being committed in your presence. That's not the case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. So I just had a quick question. I was looking through the community engagement report, and down on the bottom, way bottom on the last page, it shows kind of the response rates of different topics that folks wrote in on, and it doesn't seem to square with what was presented to us, especially looking at the increasing police response. I think is like the 9th on the list, and it made it seem like it was higher up on the list when you presented that to us. So I was just curious if I was missing something in the way that those data were presented, or if how that squared with the recommendations.
Sure. So I don't have the report in front of me, but my recollection is that it was overall, if you looked at the entirety of the responses, the theme of having police having the capacity to respond to calls was higher than number 9. So I'm not sure which footnote you were looking at, and I'd be happy to go over that together with you to dig that out. But I can tell you, as a person who was involved with the data analysis, that theme was higher up. And the thing that the online survey provided, even though it was a self-selection survey, and there's many biases, of course, involved with self-selection, but it gave us the opportunity to ask folks to give qualitative answers. And so there was an extensive analysis of the qualitative answers. And within those qualitative answers, there was a variety of things, of course, but one of them was the interest of having police having enough resources to respond to calls.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've worked our way through the questions on that engagement presentation. So this is a great spot for us to take 10 minutes and come back at 6:56 p.m. for our deliberations and feedback. Thank you, everyone. here, the remaining agenda item is our opportunity for feedback. This is essentially in the category of deliberations, except we aren't considering any motions or anything like that, since there isn't a document in front of us to amend. So the intent of this, we're going to start with a full round robin and then do additional rounds if necessary for any back and forth anything. And so the goal here is to have a conversation from which staff can take feedback as they craft the supplemental budget. So this is the time to share what you're hoping to see in terms of both the CSI and the ARPA funds as the supplemental budget is crafted. And we're just going to go starting with a round robin in the order staff provided me, which means we're going to start with Ryan Moore, followed by Raina Jackson. Ryan.
I was afraid you'd have me first. All right. So let's see. In my day job, I work for a tenant association, and I talk to people being evicted every other day, pretty much. I know this month in Eugene, there are probably about 70 renters being evicted from their homes for different reasons. Less than half of those are for non-payment. From my discussions with these people face to face, and it's anecdotal, it's not scientific, but a significant chunk of those have no plans on how to get rehoused. So the implication then is a large chunk of these people being evicted will be either couch surfing or on the street. In light of that, I know that one, we have a whole bucket of ARPA funds coming in. We also have some leeway with CSI funds to address or prevent causes of homelessness. And so my point is, I see evictions of renters, which are about 52% of Eugene's population, being a large cause of homelessness. I also see some eligible pools of money we can use to address that. So I just wanted to point that out. And I think I'll yield my time.
Thank you. Raina will be followed by Councillor Ye.
Yeah, the only comments that I really have is just as we're continuing to look at the budget, and especially with this conversation that we just had with the CSI group, is to really be as transparent as possible as how this budget is directly correlated with the things that are prioritized by the community. And anytime we can pull that out, anytime that it can be noted that this fulfills a CSI element, it should be done, just for the transparency factor, for the opportunity for the community to know and understand that they've been heard, and that and then it's represented in the budget. So everything, it kind of goes back to the comment I had with Chief Skinner. If there's allocation in the budget specifically that's going to be going specifically to de-escalation, it should be pulled out, so people have no questions about whether or not it's being done, or they have to do the guesswork. Sorry, that's my kid's bedtime alarm. And that was it. Sorry.
Thank you. Councillor Ye, followed by Councillor Groves.
Thank you, Chair. I do not have anything to add, except for I think this has been a good use of time, and I've really appreciated the conversation that happened before our break.
Thank you. Councillor Groves, followed by Siobhan.
I too, I'm kind of in the listening mode right now. I think some good questions were answered, but we still have a ways to go. But I'm interested, especially in hearing what our community members on the budget committee have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Siobhan will be followed by Councillor Keating.
Thank you. Really, the only thing that I could use some more clarification on with the prevention services is what is being done to go towards adults. I feel like there's a lot of focus on kids and then people once they've been in the system, but how do we catch the people that are on the brink, just like Ryan was saying, like they haven't actually got to homelessness yet, but they are going to be evicted. Like how can we stop that? And then the other thing that came to mind was when Chief Skinner was talking about the CSOs and the training that they will be having. I'm curious about how that'll affect, like if there's going to be any sort of effect between the armed officers and the unarmed officers, as whether or not they'll be rated or looked at it the same way in the department, not necessarily the community. And I'm very interested to learn more. That's it.
Thank you. Councillor Keating will be followed by Catherine Ryan.
Thanks, Chair. Like my colleagues have expressed, I found the conversation earlier tonight most stimulating. And I want to preface my comments in that as someone who's a labor advocate or a champion for workers' rights, I'm not a performance pay champion, but I recognize that there's an opportunity here for some accountability and a report card, a CSI or ARPA report card. Certainly the federal government would want to know how dollars are spent and where they're spent and how well our community is doing. But I'm interested in the CSI in particular to capture the successes and address the gaps. For example, if the number of responses to calls goes up and response call time decreases, then there's an opportunity for funding to go up. If there's a number of community complaints that are decreased, then there's an opportunity for funding to go up. If there's a number of calls that are answered daily or weekly or monthly that address the needs of community members across the country or across that 1 through 9 priority spectrum, then funding goes up. The piece that I think is missing is the qualitative accountability piece. We're a budget committee. We deal with numbers. We send recommendations to council quantitatively, but I wonder about our authority or the thirst that colleagues have to send a qualitative snapshot, report card, if you will, to council to better track the investments that we're making through the Community Safety Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine's going to be followed by John Jasper.
Okay, I might cut. Okay. Somebody holler if I start cutting out and I'll turn off my video. I'm having some bandwidth issues this evening. So I think I wanted to talk about, I really appreciated the overview this evening. It was a good refresher from the meeting earlier this year. And I really appreciate the effort that was made to kind of solicit feedback specifically from LGBTQ BIPOC communities. To me, that shows a recognition that those are groups that may have different experiences with the criminal justice system. And there are different things going on there. So I think it's really important that those conversations were had. What I feel like I want to see more of is then what do we do with that information specifically? How does it not get sort of folded into just sort of the bigger overall, brain dump of things, but how do we really highlight and prioritize and elevate the information that those communities are sharing with us about their priorities and about what's important to them and in what is going to help them feel safe in our community. I think, I feel that to me, that feels really, really important for how we move forward and how we think about what our role as a city is in addressing a lot of these systemic and like big picture level problems that we historically have been part of creating. So this is an opportunity, I think, to start to undo some of that really consciously. So I think that's important. And I also would maybe argue that unhoused folks are kind of part of that group too, and would be interested in what their thoughts and perspectives are around kind of CSI related priorities. On that note, I think I appreciate Skinner kind of providing a little more information about the CSOs. I think given the way that I've seen that alternative response presented in feedback, I'm not sure that I would be, I don't know, I'm not sure. I'd be very curious about whether that is what folks were thinking, and whether that would sort of pass muster for what an alternative response would look like for a lot of those. I think that's an outstanding question for me. And I think my last little bit would be around recognizing that it's going to be a little bit until the stuff actually happens, but considering using some ARPA funds on the Kahoot stabilization piece for the short term. I know it's not a long-term funding option, I recognize that, but just sort of thinking about the way we're using ARPA funds in some other places as kind of a little bit of a bridge and a gap filler to get us through into a plan and to be able to move forward. I feel like that might be a good opportunity.
Thank you. John will be followed by Councilor Zelenka.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation on the CSI information tonight. My question and comments may be stemming from a misunderstanding of what was presented last week, given how little discussion has happened on it. What I noticed was what seems to be a proposal for the ARPA funds of $1 million annually for the Navigation Center for operational costs. This seems to me to be the epitome of one-time funds and committing ourselves to an ongoing funding obligation year over year. And what strikes me so profoundly is it wasn't even 6 months ago that we had some very involved conversations regarding not cutting fire response for $1 million to levels that would be less than what we had 30 years ago. And then not even 6 months later, we turn around and say, oh, but we have all this money, let's commit to $1 million per year of ongoing funding. So if I have misunderstood somehow that of the intentionality of the operational costs of the Navigation Center, please correct me. But I have a major problem with that. This isn't a statement of the need. This isn't a statement of those who are homeless deserving it. This is simply a matter of, I don't believe that at this time, facing such huge budget shortfalls, that we can afford it. Thank you.
City Manager, did you have a?
I could answer that now, or I could wait till the end after you go through your round robins.
Go now.
I think now.
Oh, okay.
Well fresh.
So I guess what I would say is we've already committed to being partners in the Navigation Center with the county. And so we are going to have to identify an ongoing funding source. What we're projecting right now is that it's $1 million a year. So we're going to have to find those dollars. The council is going to have a work session in December around funding possibilities around homelessness and climate. In the meantime, we're going to need to find those dollars either through using these funds or reserves or something else. So the idea was, hey, we're committed, we're in. This is an opportunity for us because this is a community that's been very directly hit by COVID. We've also highlighted last week the that we would likely be adding additional funds in for fire and EMS response. So I understand your point.
Thank you. Councilor Zelenka will be followed by Eliza Kaczynski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have from the beginning thought that we should shift resources from into prevention in the overall mix of CSI dollars. And I still continue to think that, so I'd like to see a shift towards that. But I understand it's also complicated, and Cahoots is a great example. Increasing funding for Cahoots just isn't as simple as one would think it is. We're in the middle of a contract with them, which we could negotiate, but it takes a while to do that. And they're having really large problems, as is everybody else, finding qualified people to do this kind of work and recruiting people and maintaining it, and evidenced by the fact that they couldn't spend money that we gave them last year. And so I'm kind of wondering what the current status of that is, city manager, and with the whole cahoots question. And I'll follow on with that.
Yeah, I think that whole conversation about cahoot stabilization that we started to talk about last week too is something that that I've heard a couple of people here have interest in, for sure. I've heard interest in what is the stabilization of our EMS system. So my thoughts were that as we think about what a work session for that might look like, you know, that's where that would fall. Currently, we're like partway through our contract year. Chris, you could probably say more. And I think as we come around to that contract time, we're going to have a lot more knowledge about what those needs are and what kind of services we can get. I feel like that might answer your question. If it didn't, just say, see.
Chief, anything to add to that? Oh, maybe we lost Chief Skinner.
8D plus.
No, I thought it answered the question. Okay. I know that we're working on that. So it's something that isn't just something we snap our fingers and it happens overnight. So I'm curious, I'm anxious to have that issue come back to us and get a little bit more information about it so we can make some decisions, especially for in time, maybe for the supplemental budget. Is that possible?
It depends on what you're looking for by that, because that's like 3 minutes from now. I mean, like an in-depth analysis of stabilizing it, or what specifically are you hoping for?
More specifically, what's the status? What are the issues? And what are the options for resolution and their price tags?
Yeah. Let me talk to Chief Skinner about sort of the status of where we're at. I just want to be really clear with all of you that we really are very invested in Cahoots being a successful program, and it's something we're also really proud of. So I think the question is really, it's a big picture question of how do we stabilize? What is the city's role in stabilizing Cahoots? What is the city's role in stabilizing a lot of our social service providers, which has been a pretty frequent topic of conversation in almost every meeting I'm in. So I think, you know, there's that sort of short-term stabilization that Catherine talked about, and then there's the bigger picture, where are we heading with this, and where are we heading with our BLS and ALS system, and the whole thing kind of ties together a little bit. That's not possible to do by December 10th.
Right, the big picture part. But
yeah.
Hopefully the microcosm of Cahoots, because I'm interested in that whole bigger picture, especially the EMS, AVIA, and how that all works, and how we can make sure that that's stabilized and funded fully. But so there's lots of moving parts on this. And by the way, Sarah, this is my 25th budget. I think I can't remember a budget where stabilization of social services didn't come up in one of those budget meetings in those 25 years. So perennial problem, perennial topic.
Thank you. Eliza will be followed by Ryan Konopsky.
I first just want to say thank you for these meetings. I've gotten so used to making comments with spreadsheets and dollar amounts already proposed that it takes a little adjustment. But I very much appreciate the chance to have this conversation at this early stage, and thus we'll probably talk way more than anyone really wants me to. Regarding the prioritization of the rescue funds, I wanted to clarify a little bit from the last meeting, and also to thank staff for answering all my like really detailed questions about the parking fund. Parking is clearly one of our most distressed funds, and I don't think we should let our list of deferred maintenance grow forever. But with that said, when it comes to overall priorities and investments, I'm way less concerned about people saying that they can't find parking than people saying that they can't find a home. I believe at one of the council meetings when you were asking council about their priorities for this, Councilor Clark, who I don't believe is here tonight, mentioned that he felt that housing and building infrastructure to provide housing should be one of our top priorities with this money. And I would second that. Though I will note that I don't believe that Councillor Clark and I necessarily agree on the types of housing or the methodologies of providing that housing that we should focus on. I think Councillor Surratt more eloquently spoke to my thoughts on that, as well as some of our public commenters when it comes to focusing on more compact and affordable housing. I really wanted to thank as well for, I think there's some additional detail in the memo we got for this meeting about what we were actually talking about with early investments in COVID response. And I had some questions with that. With the COVID response, the bit about safe facilities, is that looking at things like upgrading ventilation systems under the expectation that we're going to have to be figuring out how to have people safely in buildings for a while? Or is that something else there? There's sort of those long-term changes included in there.
May I answer, Chair? Yep. Okay, thanks. Mia Carriaga, Central Services Director. And it actually, the answer is yes to all of that. So technology is evolving as we move through the pandemic. We've learned a lot about air quality and how to best keep air safe in both large buildings and small spaces. And new technology has been introduced along the way. So it's all of that. We've made some upgrades to facilities over the last 18 months based on what we've learned. We, in our capital improvement plan, had already intended to improve the air quality in some buildings as it aligned with different and new HVAC systems that also align with our CRO goals. And we'll continue to look at improvements like that. There are other instances where we have key access to city facilities. We'd like to continue to move towards prox card access because it requires a lot less touch to doors and such, and there's just a whole lot of things like that. We can provide you more detail if you're interested.
Okay. And then I also was really looking at like places. One of the things I think there's always a shortage of funds. There's always a lot of emergent needs, and really looking at not just sort of addressing kind of immediate, like here's the crisis of the moment, but looking at where things are that could be invested that are ongoing. So, for example, I see childcare is on there, and is there a way, as one of the early interventions for community resilience, and is there a way to look at not just sort of temporary assistance, but building something with this money that would end up perpetuating? And I'm out of time, and so I'll save my last question for later.
Thank you, Ryan. Will be followed by Councillor Semple.
Perfect, thank you. I will probably be a little bit more brief than others, but just kind of want to echo what a number of folks have said. So really interested in prevention, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of the cure. And we have a really good chance right now at some innovative stuff. So looking at alternative solutions, you know, especially for impacted communities, I think, you know, we are starting to see real data about folks who are saying these things are happening. It's not just anecdotal anymore. And, you know, this is a great opportunity. I keep seeing this as opportunity. And I really think we need to have a strong correlation with what we're talking about as a need and where we are seeing the response that we have. So I'd be very interested to see if when we have data come out that says, you know, do we have all these unmet calls? Do we need these folks at the right levels? Are the right levels coming in that we need to address these calls, or can we solve these calls that are clearly not being prioritized with the folks that that have the reciprocal level instead, right? So I think, you know, to Councillor Keating's point, I think there is some quantitative stuff too that we can really look at it as well as qualitative, because I think qualitative is really good. But I think there are some key quantitative metrics that I don't see in these presentations that I would like to to justify our decision making and maybe point to some opportunities where we can be more creative. And here, we clearly saw in the responses that alternatives are high interest of many of our community members across the board. So that is all I have. Thank you.
I don't have any comments or questions right now. Thanks.
Thank you. Then that brings us to Councilor Siret and then myself.
Thank you, Chair. Is this the same order we were in at last meeting? Because you and I were last time as well. So I actually have a lot to say, and so I might need a second round. So I'll just dive in. I think it's important to note that the City Council has been hearing input on both don't give more money to the police and please use the CSI funds for what you said they would be used for when you created the tax. So we are grappling with how we meet both those requests because frankly, I think both views are very valid. And so I would say we can work towards more investment in alternative response, including through our contract with Cahoots, which has been expanded by the city over the past several years. And that has been a very positive partnership between our police force and Whitebird. And I support us seeking other ways we might invest, not just alternative responses, but as some of you have mentioned, upstream strategies that help people thrive. We heard, our library cultural services are going to be investing in youth programming. That's a small example that we can build on. The public comment we got tonight about childcare subsidy idea, I think is another way we could explore. Quality childcare is a crucial part of helping families and ensure healthy kids. Kids are growing up healthy. And then also, as Eliza mentioned, investing in housing that is affordable to more people is also a way to help improve community health, which comes in part from stable, safe, and decent housing. I would say our commitment to the Navigation Center is also providing an alternative response and filling a serious gap in our services. The $1 million a year investment there will yield savings in other aspects of our city budget by helping people stabilize their lives and move off the street, not to mention, getting out of a traumatic situation, an unsafe situation. We should also be working in partnership with Lane County Mental Health so that people who are contacted by Cahoots or our police officers have access to crisis service, which is a serious gap in our services here in Lane County. If we could develop a local tips program, which, just on the surface sounds like it would be great, that could be a much needed addition to our ability to get people help when they need it in the moment. And then I have a few more points I'd like to make, so I will wait for another round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My turn. I'm going to say when we're talking these prioritization issues, it's kind of hard to go last because everyone brings up so many good points that now I just want to do it all, which is the opposite of how prioritization works. But there's a lot of good things have been said so far. For me, I really want to echo the prevention approach. I think there's a whole lot of a stitch in time saves 9 opportunities that we have right now. ARPA is a relatively large bucket of one-time funds, which is a awkward way. It's hard to find the right way to use that, but I think where we have opportunities for stabilization items or things that will really pay at, I think there's ways to use it as an investment, and knowing that we're not getting that chunk again, if we can invest it in ways that will prevent some of the ongoing struggles we've been trying to stay afloat on up to now, those are going to be by far the most effective uses of that money. So anywhere we can find ways to use that one-time chunk that will be preventive moving forward would be excellent. Back in public comment, someone mentioned the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, I believe, and that stabilizing things like that and investing in our housing options rather than scrambling to deal with ever increasing homeless populations. Those types of approaches it's more philosophical, not talking individual programs and dollars and cents, because I don't know the options as well as staff does, but that general philosophy is how I would like to see the ARPA funds approached. As for the CSI, I think that we've really touched on a very interesting challenge that when it comes down to it, we're trying to meet the needs of a community where not everyone in the community needs the same thing from our community safety infrastructure. There are members of our community who want and need a stronger police presence in order to be and feel safe. And there are members of our community who feel less safe as the police presence increases. And there isn't a way to average that out and pretend there's just a single one-size-fits-all option. That is an active struggle that we're always going to have to keep in mind exists. We have that divide, and we need to try to find some approach that really speaks to those individual needs, not just one answer that will help everyone. And my time's ticking down, so I'm probably gonna need a second round too, because that one needed a little more expansion, but that's 3 minutes. So I've seen Eliza, Ryan, Councilor Surratt, and John all wanted a second round. That's the order the hands were raised. So let's just go that way. Let's bounce back to Eliza.
It came up a couple times tonight. Councilor Keating and Ryan both brought it up, but one of the things that when we're looking at organizational resilience and ways to kind of help us make these decisions, this kind of qualitative and quantitative data about is the money that we're investing producing the results that we wanted to have. I think John and I are the only citizen members who have been on budget committee long enough to have attended one of those public, what are they called? Service profiles or whatever, which I think, so that sort of says something about how long it's been since budget committee has been able to have sort of qualitative or quantitative data about like, are the programs working and are they doing what they should be doing? And so I feel like particularly as we're moving into a space where there's likely to be a lot of really difficult decisions, some way to reintroduce that, not just for the CSI funding, but for lots of different areas, I think would be helpful, and help build our sort of resilience and our ability to make good decisions about how to invest money going forward. And so that was what I kind of wanted to second. And so.
Thank you, Ryan.
I'll be very quick. I meant to mention this in my first round, but I wanted to underscore Karin Knutsen's public comment of making the Affordable Housing Trust Fund whole. And I mean, that at the very least, maybe increasing. Housing is, I think, the most dire need, at least from where I sit. That's all.
Councilor Surratt.
Thank you. So I started my little speech saying, we're hearing from both people, and I think Ty, you encapsulated the conundrum quite well in terms of the different views that folks in our community have. So the next part of what I wanted to say is I do think we still need to add more officers to our force so that we can be responsive to those calls to service, to intervene in situations that require a police response. We have people breaking into other people's homes while they are home and they are on the phone trying to get police response, and that needs to come rapidly. And also, so our current officers are not being made to work forced overtime, mandatory overtime for months at a time, which is not a way to have a healthy workforce. I think we forget sometimes when we talk about the cops or police, these are human beings. They are workers for our city. and they have to have some consideration through that lens. I will, just as an aside, let Chief Skinner know that I can't support the idea of our CSOs carrying tasers. In my mind, that will defeat the purpose of having them show up as a lower level of force to provide service. Tasers can be lethal. And so I would encourage the chief to reconsider that idea and think of alternatives. But we are also investing in alternative ways through our community court to hold people accountable for minor infractions that don't result in them being burdened with traffic tickets. And that memo that we got talks about new partnerships there, including cultural services offering alternative community restoration projects for people that allow them to assist with downtown art installations, which I think is amazing and fantastic. We've got a partnership with Food for Lane County to make sure that folks who are going through the community court have access to food. And we've added, we have a case manager as well that works with folks who are enrolled through that program. And lastly, I would say, while I don't have specific items to offer in terms of dollars and amounts, you know, that's generally how I am thinking about both the ARPA funds and the CSI funds. And then in terms of the Kahoot stabilization conversation, I still don't believe it's the city's responsibility to use our general fund taxpayer dollars to stabilize a private nonprofit, even one that's as important a partner in our work for public safety as Kahoots is. But I am open to the idea of using some ARPA funds to contribute to their efforts to stabilize. So I just wanted to share that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, John, myself, and then Siobhan.
Thank you. I actually have, this is a question for Chief Skinner if he's still on. I'm fully supportive of the alternative responses and prevention, and I think it's absolutely important. I'm curious, Chief, to get your input on, I presume you read the Chamber of Commerce homeless report recommendation of increased enforcement and accountability as a vital facet of addressing the entire problem. Where does this, enacting that, where does doing that land in your view? Is this a resource issue, or is this a direction from council and the city manager on how we're going to be addressing the behavior of certain individuals in a way that makes the community unsafe?
It's somewhat of a complex answer, John. One thing I would point out is that this council and this city manager has been very, very good about allowing me to do my job as your law enforcement professional that is privileged to lead the men and women of the Eugene Police Department around the enforcement or the strategies around enforcement that we take. So I would say that solely and squarely lands with me on strategies. I have been purposeful around pulling police away from some of the first touch of homeless service types of things, the illegal camping, some of the low level, more livability types of issues. And that's been so that we could create space for a different type of response to come in there as the first touch. We see that with our park ambassadors, we see that with kind of our outreach teams and parking enforcement and public works doing some of those types of things. We are positioned and poised to hold people accountable for behavior. There's no question about that. The type of behavior that we're talking about oftentimes is behavior that we're trying to enforce after the fact that we don't actually witness. And so there's some challenges around how we recreate and hold people accountable for behavior that we don't witness. And in some cases we can do those investigations, in other cases we can't. Again, it is always leveraged against the other things that we have to respond to. The priority calls that we have, the multiple call response for code 3 calls is unbelievably high, which draws our resources away from doing those types of in-depth investigations. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't say that enforcement on the front end isn't the entirety of the problem. we have a back end that oftentimes doesn't support a heavy enforcement model. We continue to try and find capacity in our community, in our municipal court capacity with restorative justice programs, diversion programs, all the way to the number of jail beds for those serious offenders that unfortunately need incarceration in our community. And that currently stands at 15 for most of these types of crimes that you're talking about, with Lane County Jail and another 10 to 15 in Springfield. So it's a bigger issue around the system that we have, not necessarily just a philosophy around enforcement. So it's all those things. And so it's just not a real simple answer to your question. I apologize for that.
No, I understand and I appreciate it. And I think it kind of reiterates the point I was trying to make last week on disbursement of funds when there's additional revenues to be somewhat consistent with what the initial intentionality of the CSI, that the courts were to be getting 15%, so I would like to see us to continue to support the courts because it is a whole system approach. And then just in my last minute and a half here, this is, I mentioned this at the end of last budget season, and I would like to put this forward again. I think the citizen members could really benefit from some direction on addressing policy decisions versus the money decisions. This is an ongoing debate that we've had every single year I've been here. And I think, the example tonight being, the navigation center, here's a policy decision that has very significant budget committee ramifications that, we're pushing through on a supplemental budget without the opportunity for the whole thing. And ultimately it's, the answer is, well, it was a policy decision. And yet, as the budget committee, we don't have the money to give, the funds to give it. So we will be tasked next spring to cut money from something else. But that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So diving back into the prevention conversation, I also wanted to tie it a little bit more to the CSI and specifically to the unanswered calls metric, and just point out that there is also a way that one way to reduce the number of unanswered calls is if we can do things that reduce the number of calls that are being made in the community. Now, obviously, there's limits to how much crime can be prevented or how much perceived crime, but certainly we just had a discussion about how some portion of the calls that we receive are livability issues for people concerned about homeless encampments and things like that. So there's definitely room there for some reduction in the number of calls that are made to probably be possible if we're able to get out in front of some of the issues that we have driving our increases in homeless population and things like that. So that was a reminder to me of how deeply everything is interconnected. And so that I just found striking. As for overall feedback of what I would like to see, I think it's just really good to keep emphasizing those alternative responses as much as possible. That's my biggest takeaway from those engagement surveys. I saw that being what the community is really looking for. And I appreciate the work that's going into that effort. The CSO model and working on expanding that and building that out is definitely a step in that direction. So I'm really glad to see that we have had some change already from the original conception of the CSI to utilize that tool in a bigger way than was originally planned. There's some implementation details that have been discussed that I think are worth continuing to dig at. I definitely agree with Councilor Syret that I do not want to see them armed in any way. That I think does defeat the purpose. So I'm not a fan of hearing the taser possibility, but those are details for the chief to continue working on. And I do appreciate that Chief Skinner mentioned not wanting to avoid mission creep and being cognizant of that. So I think continuing to look at that is a good thing. And so that's kind of, I think where my thoughts are right now on what I'd like to see happen as we start putting numbers to all of these concepts. Siobhan.
Thank you. So I just wanted to reiterate, like I was listening to everybody, and so I would really love the data on the unanswered calls and the answered calls from Chief Skinner. And then I would also like to know, you mentioned that some of the training is having some of the people who have experienced their services come back and speak to the officers. So I would like to know more about how that's going and who gets chosen to come back and speak. I would also like to stress the importance of reaching out to our communities that tend to be negatively impacted by the services of the police. And then I would be remiss if I didn't point out that 80% of the CSI funds are dedicated to punitive responses, not prevention. And also we seem to be leaving out that gap of the adults. It was nice to hear Councillor Sarette mention that some of the ARPA funds could be used to help in this area with bringing adults back from the brink, or maybe even I was looking at the uses, provide services to disproportionately impacted communities. I heard from the Human Rights Neighborhood Involvement Commission that they are looking into a community center. And so I'm not sure if there's any way to put some of the funds in there. I am new, so I'm just asking questions off the top of my head. And then wanted to echo what Raina said about transparency, because sometimes the public doesn't necessarily know what we're talking about. They don't always have the time to attend these meetings. So we could just make sure, like, if the funds are going towards this, if they can just hear that their voices have been heard, I think it would make a lot of progress in the steps that we take. And then I would also like to know a little bit about, since we are all sitting here deciding how some of these funds will be used, I would love to know how our public safety, our courts, the fire, EMS, police, all that stuff, and how often they have actually experienced the services that they offer. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have Councillor Groves.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I don't want to try and tell Chief Skinner how to equip his people, because he knows that better than I do, and I think we do. The reality is, though, I can tell you, as having been a responder for many years myself, the way calls are dispatched are not always the way they end up when you get there. And frequently you end up in very, very dangerous situations that you have to decide on the fly how you're going to handle. Now, on the fire side, you're always going in as a team. CSO sometimes is going in fact, usually going in by themselves. The other thing I want to say is I agree on prevention. I think ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure, as my mother used to always say. I also like the alternative service deliveries. I like the rest of the community. I love the concept of cahoots, although there are some things that need to be worked on in that model. You know, we've heard a lot from the community who's talked about wanting alternative service models. We've heard a lot from different people. There's one group we haven't heard anything from, and that's line level responders. I think it would be helpful to hear from some of them and their thoughts and how they see the system working or not working. And that's not to take anything away from the chiefs. I was a chief for 10 years myself. And I can tell you, the further you get away from the street work, the harder it is to see how trends are changing, even though you have the statistics in front of you. When you're at the granular level, at the street level, things look and feel different. And I think that that might be a valuable discussion to have with a select group of responders at some point. The other piece is along those same lines is we try to evolve the system and apply money in different areas. It's helpful to know really what's being seen at that street level. So I would encourage us to look at that kind of a model. And another thing I want to flow out to my colleagues, I took a tour of our municipal court this morning with presiding court judge, Greg Gill, and it was very enlightening. We talked a lot about the system and how it works together. Last week, I met with the sheriff I'm going to be taking a tour of the jail on Friday. I've been in the jail many times on calls, fire and medical, but I don't know how it works today. And so I'm trying to understand that and be able to pull these pieces together. I meet with Chief Skinner frequently. In fact, I'm speaking with him tomorrow. Just a thought to float out. It kind of helps tie this together when we're able to talk to the people that are doing the work. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Semple and then Councilor Siret, please.
Thank you. One thing we haven't talked about is economic development and jobs and our local entrepreneurs. We have a lot of good businesses here that could expand and hire a lot more people. And I'd really like us to support our local businesses. And I think some ARPA funds can be used for business development. And we haven't mentioned that. And, you know, I think you know how I feel about community safety and homeless efforts and housing. Those are all critical. But I don't want us to forget that we need a way to earn the money to pay those rents.
Councilor Siret and then Eliza.
Thank you. Yeah, I just, in response to Councilor Grove's comments, I don't think I have ever made a tactical suggestion to our police chief before, either in a public meeting or a private setting. But for 2.5 years, I was the policy advocate on the use of tasers for the ACLU of Oregon and helped shape the Police Commission's recommendation to Chief Kearns about the use of tasers. So I have watched many videos of people being tased. I have studied the data about how they are used and what impacts they can have on people. And so because that was specifically mentioned, I felt like I had to speak up. Otherwise, I totally agree that Chief Skinner knows how to do his job, and I support him in doing that, and support the city manager in her role as his supervisor. You know, I appreciate Councilor Grove's visiting with Judge Gill and visiting with the sheriff. I wonder if you've considered reaching out to the district attorney, who also plays a huge role in our public safety system, and sometimes in ways that I think a lot of us don't know and understand, and would be disappointed in if we knew some of the choices that our district attorney is making in terms of following through on prosecuting people who probably deserve to be prosecuted for their crimes. So, thank you.
Thank you, Eliza.
Just to sort of follow up a little bit, Ryan mentioned his day job earlier. My day job is I work in human resources for a mental health agency, not located in Eugene. So when we're talking about jobs and economic development and making sure that people are able to work in a way that allows them to live sort of a solid life, to be supported, to be able to afford housing, our investments in things like Cahoots, because the people who work for Cahoots, that's their job, they get paid for that, in mental health services, in you know, all of these community services and supports, that has a dual thing. It creates good jobs that people can work at and have living wages at, and you know, provides these critical services for our community. So if we're thinking about economic development and jobs, I would encourage us to realize that investing in our mental health system, in our community, in our safety systems, in our support systems, those are things that create jobs.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the discussion we've had here, and I think that we definitely generated feedback for staff. I think our mission has been accomplished. I wish staff good luck sorting through all of that and incorporating it into the supplemental budget. As a committee, our next steps is that we have another meeting scheduled December 8th, which will be a review of the supplemental budget once we do have something a little more concrete that hopefully takes into account the feedback that we've been able to offer, along with all the other massive list of variables that staff is balancing. So as they go off and spend the next month and a half putting that together, we will be able to reconvene December 8th for that review, and then we'll go from there. I'm still doing a little bit of work with staff on figuring out exactly what that meeting looks like. This series of meetings this fall goes back to that motion last spring that did include the phrasing we should be giving recommendations. And exactly what that looks like isn't totally clear. There's maybe some thought that like some sort of non-binding motion to urge council to something that we all like, blah, 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 could be the type of structure of something that would be nice to pass. But there's a logistics problem with a single meeting of that we don't really have any opportunity to debrief, craft a motion, come back, and crafting a motion on the fly is generally not effective. So exactly what all of that looks like isn't completely set in stone yet, but we will be definitely reviewing supplemental budget and seeking some way to craft recommendations. I welcome any input if anyone has thoughts on how they would like to see that done before that meeting approaches and before I have to sit down and hammer out an agenda with staff. Please do reach out to me, and I always welcome any committee members' thoughts on how they think we might be able to do that better, since this whole sequence is still a little bit of a new work in progress. But I think I'm really glad we're having these meetings. I think this went really well tonight, and I think I'm looking forward to that meeting on December 8th as well. So until then, everyone be well, and I will see you then. We can adjourn at 7:53.